Okay, so this video is about the isosceles triangle theorem. Let's go over a few things about an isosceles triangle first, and then we'll talk about what the actual theorem states. So this is an isosceles triangle, and when you guys were doing your notes, the cut and paste activity, you were supposed to have identified an isosceles triangle as having two congruent sides. Okay? Well, those two sides that are congruent, those are called legs. Okay? So the two congruent sides are called legs. Two congruent, I don't know why I put an S there. Two congruent sides. Okay? So if I'm talking about the legs of this triangle, I'm talking about this side and this side right here. Those are my two congruent sides. Those are my legs. Okay? Alright. Now, so here and also here. Okay, now, an isosceles triangle has something called base angles. Okay, but before we do that, let's talk about what I mean by base. So we've named these two sides. Well, the third side is called the base. And the base is the side that touches the two legs. Okay, it's the third side. It's the non-congruent side. The base is going to be the third side. So this is the base right here. Okay? So the base is the third side. Okay? Now, moving on, we've got what are called base angles. So the base angles are the two angles that are attached to the legs and to the base. Okay? So this is the base angle because it's touching the legs and the base. Okay, so we've got what are called base angles. Okay, so the base angles are the two congruent angles, and they're always adjacent to the base, meaning they touch the base. Okay. You can also kind of look at it as like, okay, if I'm talking about a leg, if I draw an arrow from the leg to this corner, and an arrow from the leg to this corner, those are my congruent angles. Okay? Those are my base angles. Those are my congruent angles. Okay? So these angles here. And then the last vocabulary word is my vertex angle. And that's going to be the top of my triangle. And the vertex angle is formed by the legs. It's that third angle. It's not congruent. It's this angle right here. That's my vertex angle. Okay? Alright, so the theorem states that if two sides are congruent, then two angles are congruent. And also its converse, if two angles are congruent, then two sides are congruent. Okay? So in other words, isosceles triangles always have two congruent sides and two congruent base angles. Bottom line, that's how you do it. Okay? So, in example 1, it says, triangle ABC, it says that these are my base angles, so the sides opposite my base angles are going to be congruent. Okay? So I know that x is equal to 8 because the angles across from the legs are congruent. Okay? We can say because the base angles are congruent. Okay? So that means that the legs are congruent. Okay? Alright, moving on. Number 2, find the value of x. So, what we see is that we have two congruent legs, so that must mean that the angles across from the legs are congruent. So that means that x equals 85 because the legs are congruent. Now you could have put the congruent symbol, you didn't have to write out the whole word. Okay? So example 1 and example 2 are just basically saying, if my angles are congruent, then my legs are congruent. And if my legs are congruent, then my angles are congruent. It's just showing both of those theorems. Alright, so it's going to get a little bit harder, but not too terribly hard. Let's look at example 3. So example 3 says that we have two congruent legs, right? So we need to find this angle up here. That's going to be my vertex angle. It's not my base angle, because my base angle, remember, is across from my vertical side, or my congruent sides. So here are my legs, you'll see. And so 85 is going to be the same as that side, right? We draw an arrow to the opposite angle. And so that must mean that angle C is also 85. Okay? And now we're going to use our triangle angle sum theorem that we did yesterday. So 85 plus 85 plus x equals to 180 degrees. Okay? If I add 85 and 85, I get 170 plus x equals 180. Subtract your 170, so x is equal to 10. Okay? So I was finding my vertex angle. So it's not going to be the same as my base angle. My base angles will be congruent, but my vertex angle will not. Okay? Alright, example 4. Same thing. This time it says find x given that side BC is congruent to side BA. So here's side BC, here's side BA. So what do we know about these two angles? We know that they are congruent. So we say 4x plus 5 is equal to 5x minus 10. Okay? And then you just solve. So I'm going to move 4x over here because 5x is bigger than 4x. So subtract 4x from both sides. And we get 5 equals x, oops, that says minus 10. 5 equals x minus 10. And then we're going to add 10 to both sides. So 15 equals x. Okay? Alright. Example 5. Find the value of x. Well, it tells us that our base angles are congruent. So if our base angles are congruent, then the sides opposite the base angles are congruent. So that side is going to be congruent to that side. Okay? So 3x minus 13 equals 2x. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. We want to make sure that our x's stay positive. It just makes more sense that way. So this is my positive side, like this is the side that has more, this is Texas. So I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. And that gets me x minus 13 on this side, and that gets me 0 on that side. 0 is allowed, guys. We can get 0. It's okay. Alright, so now we'll add 13 to both sides. That cancels, so x equals 13. Okay? Alright, example 6. Example 6 is talking about an isosceles triangle still. So I know that this side and this side are congruent, right? So that means that this angle and this angle are congruent. Now, I already have x in my problem, so let's call this angle y. If that's angle y, then I know this angle is also angle y. Everybody with me? Now remember our triangle angle sum theorem. Okay, all three angles add to 180. So this is 30 plus y plus another y is equal to 180. Okay? Draw your wall. 30 plus 2y equals 180. Subtract your 30. 2y equals 150. So y equals 75. Okay? So I got y. Well, they didn't ask me to find y, they asked me to find x. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to label y in my picture. So I know y is 75. And so what do I know about these two angles right here? They form a line, right? So a linear pair. So that means that 75 plus x is equal to 180. Okay? So now I'm going to draw my wall, subtract my 75, and I'm left with x equals 105. Okay? So on this one, I found my base angles. Anytime you see something is congruent, but they don't give you a measure for it, you can always just put like a letter in there for it and make that same letter in the next place. Alright, so example 7 is a little bit tricky. Okay, we're going to have lots and lots of hops to go. But we're going to start with the fact that they labeled this 122. Okay, so immediately I start looking for linear pairs or vertical angles or anything that I can use. And in this case, I need to get inside this triangle. So to get inside the triangle, I'm going to talk about this angle right here. Okay, so that means I can take 122 and that angle right there, and together they make 180, right? So we're going to say, we'll call this angle y. So this is 122 plus y equals 180. So y is equal to 58. Okay, so this angle now is 58. And if I know that's 58, I have an isosceles triangle. How do I know that? Because the sides are right here. So that means that this angle and this angle are congruent, right? So that means that this angle right here is also 58 degrees. Okay? So I have two angles here. How do I get my third angle? Well, let's call this last angle angle A. I don't like Z because it looks like an S, like a 2. So if that's angle A, then I know that 58 plus A adds to 180. So 58 plus 58 plus A equals 180. Okay? 58 plus 58 plus A. That's 58 here and 58 there because this is an isosceles triangle. So 58 plus 58 is 116 plus A equals 180. 116 plus A equals 180. Now we're going to subtract 116 from 180 and we get 64. So angle A equals 64. So we'll go ahead and write it in there. Now, remember, to get to here, I've got to do some vertical angles and some hopping. Can we do some vertical angles? Yes. This angle and this angle are going to be congruent. Agreed? So that means that this right here has to be 64. And then, notice how I have another set of isosceles triangles, or sides. See? Now I know that these two sides are congruent because they have two tally marks. So that means that this angle and this angle are congruent. Right? Those are my base angles. So this angle over here is also 64. Make sense? Okay, last one we have to find. Let's call it B, because once I found this one, I can find the X, right? So let's go ahead and call it B. So 64 plus 64 plus B equals 180. 64 plus 64 is 128. And then subtract it from 180. B equals 52. So if this is 52, now I can find X. X is found by doing a linear pair. Right? So it's X plus 52 equals 180. So X, if I subtract 52 from 180, I get 128. And I found my answer. Granted, that's a lot of steps. I would never assign a problem like that for a test unless maybe I put it as an extra credit problem. So I would study it because it would be a great extra credit problem on your next test. Alright, what page does this get glued on? Glued on page 31. Make sure you glue this down on page 31.